Thus far, we've talked a lot about CEO pay and performance monitoring, but this board does a lot more than that. They do, in fact, have to validate the strategic plans of the CEOs in a lot of cases. Particularly strong boards will exert a lot of control over those kinds of issues. And they're also responsible, particularly in the post-Sarbanes-Oxley world, of ensuring compliance. For example, now the chairman of the board has to sign off on the financials, and the audit committee is taken very seriously. The board can also be a source of advice and counsel. It can also, and further, it can be a source of resources. For example, a company CEO might need a piece of information but have no way to access that information, whereas a board of director may have a tie that would allow them to arrange a meeting, get to the right person, whatever. When we look at boards, typically good boards have a good chunk of what's called outsiders or independents on the board, as opposed to people that are all composed of employees of the firm, which by definition is an insider. And so I thought you would the easiest way to talk about this was to illustrate it with a real company. So let's change the slide and look at Netflix. This is the board of directors for Netflix. You can see that they have 9 members, and that 5 of the 9 are independent. Incidentally, some of the names that are not listed as independent are not current employees of Netflix, so they have some sort of relationship with the company that's not obvious from their biographies. Notice the 3 principal committees: audit, compensation, and governance. Governance has to do with the makeup of the board, and then audit, the financials, and compensation, CEO compensation. Notice that on the compensation committee, very appropriately, there are only independent or outside directors on that committee. But you'll also notice it's actually not apparent on this chart, but Reed Hastings, the CEO and founder of the company, is also the chairman of the board. And so that leads to the question, is it appropriate for the CEO to be the chairman of the board? That's a great discussion, and one I look forward to having with you a little bit later. I thought I'd taken that chart out, apologize for that. So a lot of these things are self-evident as far as what constitutes a good board. But I want to talk about that middle bullet of own a good chunk of the company stock. Think about that for a second in terms of who that limits board membership to. And let me give you an example. Many years ago, there was a young Arkansas company growing rapidly, very successful. And that Arkansas company also had a very young governor with a brilliant wife who was a trained lawyer. And that company invited that trained lawyer onto the board. Now, this governor and his wife didn't have much money then. They were still relatively early in their career and had all been in public service. So if they mandated that everybody that's on the board had to have a good chunk of stock, this individual would not have been able to be on the board. Now, I'm going to throw out some names that may affect how you feel about this whole conversation personally, but that company is Walmart. That young Arkansas governor was Bill Clinton, and his wife was Hillary Clinton. And so Hillary Clinton was on the board of Walmart, I believe it was in the 1980s, and she would not have been had it been for the requirement to own a lot of stock. So when you require that, you're basically saying only rich people need apply. So let's take a shift for a second and look at people off the board that also tend to monitor carefully the role of and the actions of the CEOs. Part of this takes an understanding of just how diffuse membership is, ownership is of most U.S. corporations. Again, let's use Netflix as our example to take a look at how it works for them. This shows the ownership distribution for Netflix stock in the fall of 2015 as I make this video. You can see in that top block, percent of shares held by all insider and 5% owners, 2%. That means that no individual owns more than 2% of that stock. And if you go down to the 88%, that says that 88% of all Netflix stock is owned by institutional holders or mutual fund holders, which is to say only 12% of Netflix's stock is actually held by individuals. If you go further down, you can see that the largest single holders of Netflix stock are T. Rowe Price and Vanguard, with between 5 and 6% of the total ownership. So in sum, no single entity owns more than 6% of Netflix's stock. So this idea is stock ownership is quite diffuse. A consequence of this diffuse ownership is that sometimes people with relatively small stakes, that would be activists, can exert a lot of influence. It also says, very interestingly, that the mutual funds and the institutions, Vanguard, T. Rowe Price, and the like, really have a lot of power because they're the ones with big chunks of stock, and they're the ones that can decide whether to support or not support initiatives. For example, when Michael Dell took Dell private a couple of years ago, it were the mutual funds that had enough stock to sway one way or the other whether the decision to take the firm private was going to go forward. And you're seeing increasingly these mutual funds be more activist in their engagement with corporate management about what they do and don't do. And so we've created this kind of third animal called the mutual fund that's really going to have a lot of power. Just going on beyond them, though, there are lots of other people that exert power. You can have hostile takeovers. An example of a hostile takeover is when Kraft bought Cadbury. There have been lots of other unsolicited offers. Men's Warehouse, and I'm having a Joseph A. Banks. I had a senior moment there. All that was that merger was initiated as a hostile takeover. So these things happen. And then today, if it were allowable, how many of you in BSG have beaten your stock price down so low that if somebody starts to do well, they could just scoop in and buy your company and discharge you because you're relatively cheap compared to your assets? There are other people that exert a lot of influence. Obviously, regulators, the Security Exchange Commission can have a big say. Lenders sometimes are passive, but they can have a big say. And then we're looking at these other shareholder groups, regulators, the press, and public activists. For example, Steve Jobs was pretty well known for not caring what people thought, but when he passed away and Tim Cook had a freer reign, he took to heart the criticisms Apple was getting for the working conditions where their phones and iPads were made in China. He made a trip there and told Foxconn, you're going to have to change the conditions, things are going to have to get better. And analysts can also play a role because they can criticize a company and they can narrow its options by saying, oh, we're going to encourage people to sell the stock if corporate management doesn't do X, Y, or Z. In the United States, the shareholder tends to be the most privileged. That's not true in all countries. For example, in Japan, although it's changing to more of a Western governance format, the tendency is towards consensus, and the dominant players are the banks that hold the debt. In Germany, they actually have a dual board structure, and on one of the boards, by law, it's composed of people that are not shareholders. And so because of that, employees and communities have a greater say. Some people see that as a strength, that it better represents all the stakeholders' interest. And some say, well, it makes them too conservative and unable to change and adapt to new conditions. But keep in mind that all of this is put into the mindset of that whole term, shareholder. Even in the United States, do I buy a stock because I believe in that company, or do I buy a stock because I want it to make money? Well, it's the latter, so I'm not really into it for the long haul. You can see that this idea of corporate governance is really easy in theory, but because humans are involved, it really gets messy. Look forward to more conversations about this subject.